Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is going to be a quick look and first impressions of the Mooney M20R from Carenado. The Mooney M20R was a mid-90s aircraft that had a 6-cylinder Continental IO 550, 280 horsepower 6-cylinder engine, and it is quite the little aircraft. Mooneys were always known to be very fast, but they were also known to suck a lot of gas and not have a lot of range. And I think it was the M20R that was the first to sort of combine both good gas mileage, good range, and the speed that people expected from Mooneys when they purchased them. On top of that, for its day, it had an incredible little cockpit in it with very up-to-date and modern instruments, including an autopilot system, and we'll get to that. But this is, in my opinion, if you're into general aviation aircraft and into props, a great little plane, and we'll take a look at how Carenado has modeled it and how it flies and what you get for the marketplace price. First of all, let's take a look at the liveries. This is the blue and silver and white, and it's pretty sharp looking. This is the default livery that comes with the package, and you get 4 liveries as you see here. This is being my second favorite with the sort of dark gray nose. And the third livery you get is this sort of green and gold, very indicative of its day, but it does look quite dated. The other liveries, in my opinion, are much nicer. And finally, the last livery is my favorite, the red, and that's the one you saw in the intro. That brings us into the cockpit, and this is what you get from the inside. And if you cycle through the views and press left, instead of looking over your left wing, you actually look into the rear seat. If you press right on the POV switch or your hat switch, you actually look over the left wing, over to a fuel gauge and a speed brake. And if you look up, you get the same view that you get in most of the aircraft, sort of this higher up view. And if you press down, you get yourself first here and then to the instrument views. And when you're at the instrument views, you can cycle through each of the instrument views by pressing right or left, as you would in many of the other Asabo aircraft. And I'll let you have a look at each of the instrument views here so that you can see what you get, and at the same time sort of zoom in and take a look at some of the textures. I think the textures are good in this. They could be better, but I don't really have any complaints about them. There's a number of really good textures, and then there's a few that don't quite hold up as well under scrutiny. That being said, rarely, if I'm flying, or if ever, am I getting and zooming in as close as I am during some of these videos here to show you what the textures look like. So again, even though this is the back of the seat, this is part of the cycling of the instrument views. So you'll see some of the textures on the floor could be better. They look a little low resolution compared to some of the other textures, which are good. And again, I don't think you're going to find yourself zooming in to the dashboard on this as closely as I am so that you can have a look at these textures. But you know, your mileage may vary. You can see the floor mats here. They could be better. But again, the overhead console here looks really great as much as you want to zoom in, and the vinyl on the top of the roof and on the dashboard, those textures all look great. So it kind of depends on which texture you're looking at in this aircraft model. But all in all, in my opinion, the aircraft model is very good, and the textures look good enough to hold up and for me to enjoy the aircraft. None of the textures while I'm flying take away from the experience, in my opinion. Now, while I'm letting you have a look around the cockpit here and zooming into some of the different areas for you to take a look at the textures, I might explain what might first seem strange to you is the left and right views on the POV or the hat switch. I'm not sure why the left switch looks in the back seat, but the right switch looking over the left wing, it's a little bit counterintuitive. In my opinion, I would have swapped those so that when you press left, you look over the left wing. But that looks over a fuel gauge that is kind of important. Essentially, because of the pitch of this aircraft, the fuel gauges inside the cockpit on the gauges, you'll see a left and right tank, and we'll get to that later. they're calibrated to show you how much fuel is in the tank when the aircraft is in level flight. So they're inaccurate when they're on the ground. So for that reason, Mooney put in a fuel gauge on the wing which doesn't rely on any of the electronics and is a mechanical gauge that is calibrated for when the aircraft is on the ground. So that's why you have that fuel gauge over the wing, and I'm guessing that's why they put in the view so for you to press right on the hat switch and look over the wing to see what the fuel is while you're sitting on the ground. And of course that gauge on the wing is inaccurate when you're in flight. You would rely on your standard gauges on the dashboard for that. But as you can see here, as we look around and you see it up on the dashboard, and a lot of those textures look absolutely great. And the leather on the steering wheel, when you zoom right in, maybe doesn't hold up, but all the other textures around it look great. I have no complaints with it. I think it looks great. The cockpit feels real enough when you're flying. Maybe the plates on the floor and the carpet could use some work, but otherwise I think you've got a great model and some great textures inside. And with that, we'll load up LOWZ, which if you're wondering is a payware add-on from the marketplace. In our cockpit, we'll cycle through some of the instrument views to bring us down here to the iPad that Carenado has modeled so that you can control some of the features and functions specific to this aircraft model. On the pad here, we can flip on some static elements like a ground power unit and a tow bar that gets hooked up to it, and we'll take a look at the external view so that you can see that. You can also click on the pilot and co-pilot so that from an external view you can see them. You see if we click the co-pilot door, it will open up, so that is something that we can do in the cockpit whether the static elements are on or not, and we'll go ahead and close that. And also the cargo door or baggage door in the rear of this aircraft can be open and closed, and we'll also take a look at that from the exterior. On the next page you have some options to very quickly, even if you didn't start cold and dark, you can click this option and then click done, and it will shut everything off for you. And taking a look at the exterior of the model, you can see some of those both static elements as we get around the aircraft, and the baggage door and the co-pilot's door open here. We also have the tow bar modeled as we flip that on, and you can see also the chocks under the wheels. And finally the ground power unit. And as I stated earlier, you have both pilot and co-pilot modeled on exterior views. So let's start this up from cold and dark. We'll get rid of this so you can see the magneto and start switch here. We're just going to put our prop and our throttle and our mixture to full and turn the batteries on and the alternator. Get rid of that master warning, and we're going to go over here and test our lights to ensure that they're all lit up and ready to go. We'll turn our strobe on so that we can tell everyone around us that we're about to start the engines. Make sure our fuel is on the left or right tank, and turn our fuel boost pump on, and then bring our idle back, or bring our throttle back to idle. Flip this over to both magnetos and then start. And here we go. We should be able to get a good start out of that, and bring our throttle just a little bit up past idle to let the engine warm up. And that's pretty much all there is to it. We can turn the boost pump off. That is the low fuel boost pump, so you turn that on for starting, but you can turn that off as soon as it's started. And of course we flipped our master avionics power on so that all of our avionics equipment can come to life. And we are good for taxi. Before we get this bird in the air, let's take a look at some of the avionics equipment that comes with this and that Carenado has modeled for this Mooney aircraft. One of the very first things you might notice when you flip this bird on is the Moritz engine gauges at the top here, and I guess beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but if you're from my era, this is a pretty neat set of gauges and instrument cluster. As awesome as the Garmin G1000, 3000 systems are nowadays, I just love flying these birds with the old 6-packs. If we zoom into those gauges, you can see at the top left here we have our fuel flow in gallons per hour, and our left and right fuel tanks, again, those are calibrated at level flight, so those will not be accurate on the ground. You'll have to check your fuel tank over the left wing for that. And on the second row on the left, you have your outside air temperature, your vacuum pressure, which is important to run all the instruments in the aircraft, and the amperage of one of two batteries, whichever one you have selected, that are in the Mooney. Then on the right side, with the cluster of 6 gauges, we have the prop RPM, the manifold pressure, the cylinder head temperature, the exhaust gas temperature, and the last two are the oil pressure and the oil temperature gauges. So there are a number of unique systems that Carenado has modeled for this aircraft, and I think they're pretty neat personally, but I'll go through them one by one here. This is not an instructional or tutorial on operation of these systems, but just that they are included and modeled. I have flown with this for about an hour now and played with them. They all seem to be operational. That being said, I understand that simulators like this can be very buggy in very specific situations, so I can't speak for how accurate these systems are in every situation, but they seem to be all functional to me. For starters, we have the KFC 150 flight control system, which is essentially your Garmin G1000 pre-LCD screens and computer electronics that are as sophisticated as they are in the current systems. This complete system consists of the KC192 computer controller, the KI256 flight command indicator, which replaces your standard HSI, and the KI525A pictorial navigational indicator. These systems combined make up a complete autopilot and flight director system, much like you have in the G1000, without the screen of course, but if you don't understand how to use these systems, they are pretty neat. Unique to this plane is that you have also the Garmin GPS system installed that would have been installed at a later date, so you can use the GPS system to create a plan and also use this flight director system in the Mooney here to sort of learn how to use it alongside a GPS to see how it works, or how it did work back then. It's pretty neat in my opinion. I enjoy it quite a bit. Also in this Mooney is the KX165 with glide slope receiver, a KR87 ADF for automatic direction finder, which will provide you bearing information to stations, a KT76C transponder, which would receive ground interrogations and send back ident and altitude information for flight followings, and finally a KN64 DME, which will simultaneously show you distance, ground speed, and time to station for the distance measuring equipment. You also have a number of other sort of Mooney panel specific instruments that they've modeled, so that's very nice, and of course the standard Garmin 530. In my opinion, this is a nice model of the Mooney aircraft and a nice model of its instruments that it would have had in that era. So there's plenty to play with here if you're looking to learn another aircraft or learn some of the instruments and panels from that era. I think this is a good choice. With that, let's taxi this bird out to the runway and take it for a quick flight. I will first mention that I found this to have great ground handling characteristics. So a number of, it's funny, I thought maybe it was a setting on my rudder pedals, but a number of the aircraft I find very touchy on the ground. This wasn't that way whatsoever, and I didn't change any settings to my rudder pedals, but I did find the ground handling on this very, very nice. And it seemed very realistic. It's what you would expect from a Mooney or even any type of small light aircraft like this. So now I'm not so sure that it's my rudder pedals with the included aircraft, and I'm thinking it might just be the models themselves. But anyways, we'll pull up here and hold short of the runway and set things up, get our flaps down and ready for takeoff. And with that all done, we'll roll that out to the runway here and take off heading 073 degrees, I believe. Also, plenty of power in this little thing. We're at altitude at this airport already, and it's not the longest of runways, but we've got plenty of power. And I've just got brakes on, a little bit of a short field takeoff here. Power up, release the brakes, and we'll continue our roll. I have to admit the ground handling on this, even at speed, is very excellent, and the flight characteristics in the air are very nice on this little thing. One thing it is very different is the trim on this it's a lot more sensitive than any of the other aircraft, so I'm used to sort of holding it down for a certain amount of time in the other included aircraft, and in this you don't need to do that at all. You are just touching it once or twice up or down, and it takes a little getting used to after having flown the other aircraft. I found myself a number of times pitching up or down much more than I intended to because I was used to holding the trim. In fact, I couldn't press the trim short enough sometimes in this to get it trimmed off for level flight. But not a big deal. One thing I noticed that may be a bug, I'm not 100% sure, is on the altitude pre-selector at the bottom, just right of center here. It doesn't save the mode you were in, so if you preset this before takeoff in a climb, it will reset to a descent when you engage it. So I'm pretty sure that's bugged. That threw me for a loop when I set it all up on the runway and engaged autopilot and then clicked the proper mode on the pre-selector, and next thing you know I pitch down and I'm going towards the ground. That could be pretty dangerous. I'm pretty sure the system doesn't work like that in real life. But anyways, just mention of that. Essentially that system allows sort of 3 different modes here. If on the autopilot system you press ALT for altitude, it's pretty much like your Garmin system, it's just an altitude hold. But on that altitude pre-selector itself, it has 2 buttons on the left, and on the one mode, if you press the top button, you can just pre-select a vertical climb speed, and you can select 500 feet per minute, for instance, and it will just keep climbing at 500 feet per minute and not stop at any altitude. Or the bottom button, if you press it, you can then select an altitude, for instance 10,000 feet, and dial that in, and when you reach 10,000 feet, of course, it will then just switch to the altitude hold mode, much like it would in the G1000. The knob on the right, you could actually push that in and select at which vertical speed you want it to climb to 10,000 feet. So just a little bit different than the Garmin unit, but pretty similar functionality. Essentially, the top button on the altitude pre-selector is like your VS mode on your Garmin's, and the bottom button is like your FLC or flight level change mode on your Garmin's. One thing this plane does have is tons of power, and it will climb for days. I'm just sort of more aggressively testing the vertical climb speed of this aircraft, and if you see my vertical speed indicator at bottom center there, it tops out at 2,000 feet per minute, and I had it cranked all kinds in this thing, and we're at a pretty high altitude already in the mountains here, so this thing is a great little aircraft to fly around the mountains and get to where you're going pretty quickly. It's got tons of speed and tons of climb power, so it's difficult to get into too much trouble in this aircraft when flying through the mountains. You just climb out of trouble. In this region and at this altitude, I also have my pitot heat on, obviously, and in order to prevent my windscreen from freezing over down at the bottom center here, we have our defrost and our cabin heat and our cabin vent full on. It's also a pretty easy aircraft to trim off and maintain level flight with. That being said, it does have the full flight director and autopilot system, so it's not really a requirement to fly this for long distances, at least stick fly it in level flight. But I did find when I wanted to, I level off, trim it off pretty easily. Like I said, the trim can be a touch sensitive, but other than the trim being a touch sensitive, it is a pretty easy aircraft to get into level flight. And I'm just pitching up extremely aggressively now to give a go of what the stall and flight characteristics of the plane feel like. I'm going to say that this is one area of the plane that feels a little bit lacking, not so much the flight characteristics themselves. The plane feels great flying and climbing and descending and rolling. For the most part, all my approaches were great. It's an easy plane to fly. It feels real, more so than many of the other planes, potentially any of the other planes, any of the other GA aircraft anyways. But when it comes to stalling this plane, it kind of falls on its face in that respect. I definitely say that when you're pushing any of the planes so far in Microsoft Flight Simulator to their envelopes or to their thresholds, they start to feel less realistic. It didn't seem to stall like it probably would have in real life. I actually had a bit of a difficult time getting it into a spin, which I would imagine at this altitude wouldn't be as difficult as I found it. But anyways, I'm climbing aggressively and stalling, and here I climb very aggressively and rudder over. I'm not so sure the plane would be so forgiving in real life. That being said, other than for the sake of these reviews, I would rarely fly the planes this aggressively or outside their sort of standard flight envelopes anyways, so these types of things that are unrealistic don't really affect my flying. I know some people have complained about them, but that's sort of something that your mileage may vary. If that's something that you're very interested in ensuring proper flight characteristics of an aircraft or a flight sim, to be honest, I don't know if any sim is going to hit that mark perfectly for anybody, but as far as the flight characteristics go of standard flight or within the envelope of this aircraft, I think they're very realistic, and in fact I'm pretty impressed with them, other than, like I said, these sort of extreme examples of flying this aircraft outside its envelope. And here I found an NDB in the area, so I'm tuning an NDB in to play with the direction finder a little bit, and I can confirm that any of the systems that they've modeled here that I've played with, and I've played with all of them pretty extensively, they all work as expected. So I find that, and you can see the needle flip there, and I track that NDB inbound and then outbound, and it worked just fine. Another thing you're going to like in this aircraft, of course, that the Moonies have is the speed brakes. They are great on final approach. You just want to bleed that extra 5 knots of speed off from maybe having to descend last minute from being too high, or just coming in a little bit quicker on approach, relying on your speed brakes to bring you back down to your proper approach speed. I quite enjoy aircraft with spoilers like this, so just a note that those are also modeled, and they also are visually modeled, so they come in and out of the wing when you bring them up and down. And with that, I'm just on a final approach straight in here at LOWZ, I believe. I might be wrong with that, but it's a beautiful area if you want to fly in and around this. LOWI is where I took off from, and that is one of the marketplace airports. And to conclude this review, or quick look at the Mooney in the marketplace from Carenado, I guess it's going to depend a lot on what type of pilot you are, but if you're interested in general aviation aircraft, and especially single engines, I think this is a great little model. It looks good, it's modeled well, it has plenty of period-specific toys to play with from the mid-90s there, and instruments that you may not be used to if you're not from that era, but there's plenty to learn and have fun with. So with that, guys, I hope you enjoyed the look at the Mooney M20R, and please leave a like or comment in the section below on YouTube. I do appreciate and try to answer all your questions, and I hope this has helped you decide whether or not this aircraft is for you. I'll see you in the next video, guys, and with that I'll leave you with some footage here of me taxiing back and the sounds of the Mooney. One more quick mention before we go: if you're interested in reading charts, Jeppesen charts and plates and SIDS and stars and approach plates, and wondering what all that means if you're unsure, please check out my other series where we raise the bar on flight simming and get you to understand how to read a proper approach chart or a departure or an arrival chart and low and high on route charts, and get you understanding everything you need to know to do a proper flight plan and filing and fly under instrument flight rules. Thanks very much, guys.